Story number 1. The Ghost on Highway 19. The roads in North Dakota stretch endlessly, cutting through vast, desolate plains where the wind howls like a living thing and the snow falls heavy, turning the landscape into a blank, frozen canvas. As a trucker, I've spent countless nights driving through these remote stretches, the hum of the engine my only companion and the stars above my only light. But there was one night, one stretch of road, that changed the way I see the world forever. It was a bitterly cold December evening, the kind where the air feels like it could shatter and the snow piles up faster than the plows can clear it. I was hauling a load of grain down Highway 19, a route I'd driven dozens of times before. The road was quiet, the occasional set of headlights cutting through the darkness the only sign of life. The radio crackled with static, and the CB chatter was minimal. Most truckers had already hunkered down for the night to avoid the worsening storm. I was about halfway to my destination when I saw him. He was standing on the side of the road, just beyond the reach of my high beams, his figure barely visible against the swirling snow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the windblown drifts. But as I drew closer, I could see him more clearly, a man in a heavy coat, his breath fogging in the freezing air. He raised one hand, waving slowly, as if asking for help. Something about him didn't sit right. He wasn't dressed for the weather, and his stance was odd, almost too still for someone exposed to such brutal cold. But I couldn't just leave him there, out here, miles from the nearest town. A night in the open could be a death sentence. I slowed the truck and pulled onto the shoulder, the tires crunching through the packed snow. As I reached for the door handle, I glanced back at the man and froze. He was gone. The spot where he'd stood was empty, the snow undisturbed, as if he'd never been there at all. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the roadside, my headlights illuminating nothing but the swirling storm. I rolled down the window, calling out into the night, "Hey, you need a ride?" There was no answer, just the wind, carrying with it a faint, eerie whistle that sent a shiver down my spine. I sat there for a moment, heart pounding, before deciding to keep moving. Maybe the storm was playing tricks on me, or maybe the man had walked off into the darkness. Either way, the longer I stayed, the more uneasy I felt. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but the image of that man lingered in my mind. By the time I reached the truck stop at the edge of town, I was desperate to shake the feeling that something was wrong. I parked the rig, grabbed a cup of coffee, and struck up a conversation with an older trucker sitting at the counter. His name was Earl, and he'd been driving these roads longer than I'd been alive. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, chuckling as he sipped his coffee. I hesitated, then told him what I'd seen. The man on the roadside, the way he'd vanished without a trace. As I spoke, Earl's expression grew serious, his eyes narrowing. "You were on Highway 19, weren't you?" he asked. I nodded, and he let out a long breath. "You're not the first. I've heard stories about that stretch of road for years. They say it's haunted." "Haunted?" I repeated, skeptical but intrigued. Earl leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Back in the 70s, there was a bad wreck out there. A semi jackknifed on the ice, and a car coming the other way slammed into it. The driver of the car died instantly, a young guy, just 22, heading home for Christmas. They found his body a week later, frozen solid. Ever since then, people have been seeing him. Same story every time. He's standing by the road, waving for help. But when you stop, he's gone." The story sent a chill through me, but I tried to laugh it off. "You're saying I saw a ghost?" Earl shrugged. "I'm just saying you're not the first." The storm cleared overnight, and by morning, the sun was shining weakly through a pale sky. But the memory of the man stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Couldn't let it go. On my way back down Highway 19, I decided to stop at the spot where I'd seen him. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, maybe tracks in the snow, or some kind of explanation that would put my mind at ease. The roadside was quiet, The snow pristine except for the faint ridges left by my truck's tires. I got out and walked along the shoulder, scanning the ground for any sign of the man. That's when I noticed it, a single set of footprints leading from the trees to the road. They were faint, half filled with fresh snow, but they were there, and they ended right where I'd seen him standing. I followed the trail back into the woods, my breath fogging in the cold air. The trees were dense, their branches heavy with snow, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of my boots. After about 50 yards, the footprints stopped abruptly, as if the man had simply vanished. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that he'd turned back, just a blank expanse of snow stretching into the forest. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The wind picked up, rustling the branches overhead, and for a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint voice, carried on the breeze. It was impossible to make out the words, but it sounded like a plea, desperate and forlorn. I didn't stick around to investigate further. By the time I got back to the truck, my hands were shaking, my breath coming in quick. Shallow gasps. I started the engine and drove away, leaving the empty road and its ghostly secrets behind. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it whenever I drive through North Dakota. I've heard other truckers tell similar stories, each one eerily familiar. The man on the roadside, the vanishing footprints, the sense of something watching from the shadows. Some say it's just a legend, a tale spun by the loneliness of the road. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, when the wind howls and the snow falls thick, I hear that whistle again, the faint, mournful cry of a soul still searching for a way home. Story number 2. The screams in the snow. Oregon's forests in winter are a study in contrasts. By day, the towering pines stand as serene sentinels over a landscape blanketed in white, their stillness inviting a strange kind of peace. But by night, the same forest transforms into a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, where the silence feels alive, pressing against your skin. It was in this frozen wilderness that I experienced something I still can't explain, something that has haunted me ever since. The trip started like many others. It was late January, and my friends Jack, Tony, and Carl and I decided to go hunting in the remote woods near Mount Hood. We were all experienced outdoorsmen, familiar with the dangers of the wild and confident in our ability to handle whatever nature threw at us. The area we chose was far from any marked trails, a place known for its abundant wildlife and its isolation. We reached the campsite in the early afternoon, setting up our tents in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. The snow was deep but manageable, and the air was crisp with the kind of cold that bites through even the thickest jackets. By the time the sun set, we had a fire roaring, its warm glow casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. We ate, shared stories, and laughed, the weight of the week lifting with every passing hour. The first scream came just after midnight. I was half asleep in my tent when it shattered the stillness, a sound so loud and unnatural it jolted me upright. It was high-pitched, guttural, and stretched far too long to be human. My heart raced as I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness of the tent. I could hear the others stirring, their voices tense and hurried. "What the hell was that?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, the cold hitting me like a wall. The fire had burned low, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. The forest was deathly silent, as if even the trees were holding their breath. Then it came again, the scream echoing through the trees. Closer this time. It was a sound that didn't belong to any animal I knew, a mix of agony and rage that made my skin crawl. We gathered around the fire, rifles in hand, our breaths visible in the frigid air. Carl, always the skeptic, tried to rationalize it. "Probably a cougar," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "They can sound like that sometimes, but this wasn't a cougar. I'd heard cougars before, and this was something else, something far worse. The screams continued, sporadic but relentless, each one louder and closer than the last. They seemed to come from all directions, circling us, keeping us on edge. The forest, so serene during the day, now felt alive and malevolent, as if it was watching us, waiting. The footsteps came next. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible against the crunch of the snow under our boots. But as we strained our ears, they grew louder, deliberate, and uncomfortably close. Jack shone his flashlight into the trees, the beam dancing between the trunks. For a moment, we saw nothing, just the endless expanse of snow and shadow. Then the light caught movement, a shape, tall and thin, slipping between the trees. It was too far to make out details, but its movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural. Tony raised his rifle, his hands trembling. "Did you see that?" he whispered. We nodded, our eyes glued to the spot where the figure had disappeared. The footsteps continued, circling us like a predator sizing up its prey. The screams grew more frequent, blending with the sound of heavy breathing, low and guttural, as if something massive was just beyond the reach of our lights. None of us wanted to stay, but the idea of trekking through the forest at night was equally terrifying. We debated our options in hushed tones, our voices barely carrying over the crackling fire. Then came the final scream. It was deafening, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ground beneath us seemed to vibrate, and I swear I felt the breath of something cold and foul against my neck. The figure appeared again, closer this time, its outline clearer in the dim light. It was tall, impossibly so, its limbs elongated and distorted. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was a blur of shadows, as if the forest itself was trying to mask its true form. That was all we needed, grabbing only what we could carry. We extinguished the fire and fled. The snow slowed us down, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, every tree looking the same as the last. The screams followed us, growing fainter with each step until they finally disappeared altogether. By the time we reached the truck, dawn was breaking, the first light of day casting the forest in an almost serene glow. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the night's terror had been a bad dream. We didn't talk much on the drive back to town. The fear lingered, wrapping around us like a shroud. When we finally stopped at a diner on the edge of town, we sat in silence, sipping coffee and trying to make sense of what we had experienced. None of us had an explanation. The forest had taken on a life of its own that night, and whatever was out there wasn't something we could understand or escape. In the years since, I've heard other hunters tell similar stories. The screams, the shadowy figures, the feeling of being watched. Some dismiss it as the wind, or an overactive imagination. But I know what I heard, what I saw. That forest isn't just a place. It's something more, something alive, and it doesn't want us there. Even now, when the snow falls and the wind howls through the trees, I sometimes hear echoes of those screams in my mind. They're faint but unmistakable, a haunting reminder of that night in the Oregon wilderness. And every time I hear them, I wonder if whatever was out there is still watching, still waiting for its next prey to wander into the frozen shadows. Story number 3. The Phantom Train of Frost Hollow. Montana winters are unforgiving. The cold doesn't just chill you, it seeps into your bones. A relentless reminder that nature doesn't care about survival. I had lived in Frost Hollow, a tiny town nestled deep in the Montana wilderness. For most of my life, it was a quiet place, bordered by snow-covered forests and crisscrossed by an old railway line that hadn't been used in decades. Yet every winter, the stories would resurface, whispers of a ghostly train, its whistle piercing the icy night, the shadow streaking across the snow. I never believed in ghost stories. Frost Hollow was full of them, from haunted cabins to cursed mines. The train was just another tale, passed down by old-timers to scare kids into staying close to home. But that winter, something changed. It started on a particularly frigid December night. The snow had been falling steadily all day, blanketing the town in an eerie silence. The world outside my window was dark, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp near the old train station. I was home alone, sipping coffee and trying to write when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a train whistle. It was distant at first, almost faint enough to ignore, but then it grew louder, sharper, cutting through the stillness of the night. My heart raced as I looked out the window toward the abandoned tracks. Nothing moved but the snow swirling in the wind. The whistle came again, followed by a low rumble that vibrated the floorboards beneath me. I grabbed my coat and flashlight, my curiosity overpowering my fear, and headed out into the cold. The air was biting, each breath stinging my lungs as I trudged through the snow toward the tracks. The rumble grew stronger, the whistle now blaring so loudly it seemed to shake the very ground. I reached the old station and scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of a train, and then I saw it. A shadow emerged from the darkness, streaking along the tracks at an impossible speed. The train was massive, its outline shimmering like frost on glass. It glowed faintly, an otherworldly blue light casting long shadows across the snow. The windows were dark, but I could see figures inside, blurry shapes pressed against the glass, their faces indistinct but filled with terror. The train roared past, its whistle a deafening shriek that seemed to pierce my soul. I stumbled back, shielding my face from the cold wind that followed in its wake. And then it was gone, disappearing into the night as quickly as it had come. The tracks beneath me were undisturbed, no sign of wheels or weight, just the untouched snow glistening under the moonlight. I returned home, shaken and unable to sleep. The whistle echoed in my mind, and the figures in the windows haunted my thoughts. The next morning, I told a few neighbors what I'd seen. To my surprise, they didn't laugh or dismiss me. Instead, they nodded gravely, their faces pale. "You saw it," old Mr. Harper said. "The phantom train. You're not the first." He told me the story, one I'd heard in bits and pieces over the years but never fully believed. In the winter of 1913, a passenger train had derailed near Frost Hollow during a blizzard. The wreck was catastrophic. Dozens of lives lost, their bodies frozen beneath the snow before rescuers could reach them. The cause of the crash was never determined, but rumors spread of strange happenings before and after the accident. Lights on the tracks, unexplained screams in the woods, and every winter since, the ghostly train had been seen, replaying its doomed journey through the snow-covered valley. I decided to investigate further. The town library was small but well-stocked with local history. I found old newspaper clippings about the crash, grainy photos of the wreckage, lists of the dead, and interviews with survivors. One article stood out, a first-hand account from the train's conductor, who had survived the crash but disappeared weeks later. His final words, scrawled in a shaky hand, sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't an accident. The train wasn't ours. The more I read, the more obsessed I became. Over the next few weeks, I spoke to anyone who had seen the train. Their stories were eerily similar. Hearing the whistle in the dead of night, seeing the glowing shadow streak along the tracks, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Some claimed to have heard voices, faint but pleading, calling for help from within the train. One night, driven by a mix of curiosity and fear, I decided to wait for the train. I packed a thermos of coffee, my camera, and a notebook, and made my way to the old station. The temperature had dropped to nearly unbearable levels, the snow crunching beneath my boots as I settled into a sheltered corner near the tracks. Hours passed, the cold gnawing at me as the wind howled through the empty station. I was on the verge of giving up when the ground began to tremble. The whistle came first, long and mournful, sending a shiver down my spine. Then the rumble, growing louder with each passing second. The train appeared, bursting out of the darkness like a nightmare made real. This massive frame shimmered in the moonlight, the glowing windows casting eerie shadows on the snow. This time, I saw the figures more clearly. They were passengers, their faces pale and frozen, their hands pressed against the glass. Some screamed silently, their mouths wide with terror, while others stared blankly, as if resigned to their fate. I raised my camera, my hands trembling as I snapped photo after photo. The train slowed as it approached the station, its whistle now a deafening roar. For a moment, I thought it might stop. The doors began to open, and a figure stepped out, a man in a conductor's uniform, his face hidden in shadow. He raised a hand, beckoning me toward the train. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The conductor tilted his head, as if waiting for me to decide. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the train began to move again. The doors closed, and the conductor stepped back inside. The whistle shrieked one last time, and the train vanished into the night, leaving me standing alone in the snow. When I returned home, I developed the photos, hoping for proof of what I'd seen. But the images were distorted, filled with streaks of light and shadow, the train's outline barely visible. The figures inside were gone, replaced by smears of blue and gray. I've tried to make sense of it, but I can't. The train defies explanation, its presence a chilling reminder of the lives lost on that fateful night in 1913. Even now, when the wind howls and the snow falls heavy, I hear the whistle in the distance, calling out from the past. And I wonder if the phantom train is still searching for passengers, doomed to ride the rails forever. Story number 4. The Cabin of Silence. Alaska's wilderness is a realm of extremes, stunning in its beauty and terrifying in its isolation. The endless forests and snow-covered peaks seem to stretch forever, swallowing sound and light in equal measure. I had come to Alaska seeking solitude, a break from the noise and chaos of the world. But what I found in that cabin amidst the frozen woods was something I will never forget. It started with a storm, the kind of storm you hear about but rarely see, where the snow falls so heavily it blurs the line between ground and sky, and the wind howls like a living creature. I was miles from the nearest town, having rented a small, secluded cabin as a temporary refuge while I explored the surrounding wilderness. The storm hit hard that evening, the snow piling up against the windows, and the wind rattling the wooden walls like an angry beast. The cabin itself was rustic but sturdy, a single room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a cot pushed into the corner. It was cozy enough, with just enough firewood to last a few days if the storm lingered. I stoked the fire, poured myself a cup of coffee, and settled into an old armchair with a book, feeling the kind of peace that only comes from true isolation. The first knock came just after midnight, a soft, deliberate thump-thump on the wooden door. It wasn't the wind or the settling of the cabin. It was unmistakably the sound of a fist knocking. My heart jumped as I sat bolt upright, listening intently. Who could be out here in the middle of nowhere? In the dead of a snowstorm? I grabbed a flashlight and approached the door, my footsteps muffled by the thick rug. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the latch and pulled it open, bracing against the icy wind that rushed inside. But there was no one there, just darkness and snow, the forest beyond obscured by swirling flakes. "Hello," I called out, my voice swallowed by the storm. No answer. I shone the flashlight around, searching for any sign of movement, but the ground was pristine, untouched by footprints or tracks of any kind. Closing the door, I locked it and returned to my chair, my nerves on edge. I told myself it must have been my imagination, the sound distorted by the storm. But then it came again, thump-thump, louder this time, more insistent. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. The knocking was coming from the same door I had just checked, the same door that led only to a world of snow and silence. Summoning my courage, I grabbed the axe I had brought for chopping firewood and approached the door again. This time, I flung it open with force, ready to confront whatever or whoever was out there. The snow whipped into my face, blinding me for a moment. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but a blank canvas of white. And yet, as I stepped out onto the porch, I saw them, footprints, large, heavy prints that started from the forest's edge and led directly to my door. But there were no prints leading away. It was as if whoever or whatever had come to my cabin had vanished into thin air. I slammed the door shut, bolting it and pushing a heavy chair against it for good measure. My breath came in short, panicked bursts as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me, that there was no such thing as ghosts or monsters lurking in the Alaskan wilderness. But the knocking continued, came at irregular intervals, sometimes loud and urgent, other times soft and almost hesitant. It moved, first at the front door, then at the windows, then at the back wall of the cabin where there was no door at all. I felt trapped, my sanctuary turning into a prison as the relentless knocking seemed to mock me. By dawn, the storm had begun to subside, but the knocking did not stop. Exhausted and desperate, I decided to follow the footprints into the woods, hoping to find some logical explanation for the night's events. I bundled up against the cold, grabbed my axe and flashlight, and stepped outside. The snow was deep, the air biting against my skin as I followed the trail of footprints. They led straight into the forest, winding between the tall pines, each step eerily perfect, as if the maker of the prints had been deliberate in their path. The further I went, the quieter the world became. The sound of my own breathing and the crunch of snow underfoot the only noises breaking the silence. The footprints ended abruptly in a small clearing. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of where the person or thing had gone. The snow in the clearing was undisturbed, save for a small patch in the center where the snow had melted away, revealing bare, frozen ground. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the clearing was unnaturally warm, the air heavy with a strange, electric charge. And then I heard it, a whisper, soft and breathy, like the sound of wind through the trees but unmistakably human. Spoke my name. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the dim light, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing through the clearing. My name, repeated over and over. A plea, a warning, curse I couldn't tell. Panic overtook me, and I turned and ran, stumbling through the snow, the whisper following me all the way back to the cabin. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me, my heart racing as I leaned against the wall. The whispers faded, replaced once more by the relentless knocking. I didn't dare answer it again. By the time the storm finally passed and the rescue team arrived, I was a wreck, hollow-eyed and shaking, unable to explain what had happened. The rescuers found nothing unusual. No footprints, no melted clearing, no sign of anyone but me. They chalked it up to stress and isolation, product of my own mind. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. Even now, months later, I can't forget the sound of the knocking, the sight of those footprints leading only toward the cabin. I dream of the whispering clearing, of the patch of bare ground in the middle of the snow. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I think I hear it again, the soft, deliberate thump-thump of something knocking, waiting to be let in. Story number 5. The vanishing in the snowstorm. Winter in Colorado is both breathtakingly beautiful and brutally unforgiving. The mountains, draped in thick blankets of snow, hold secrets whispered by icy winds and hidden beneath layers of ice. I've always been intrigued by stories of the unexplained, but nothing could have prepared me for the events of last December. A tale that still sends shivers down my spine every time I recall it. It started innocently enough. I was driving to a remote ski lodge for a weekend getaway with my best friend, Mark. The forecast had warned of an incoming snowstorm, but we figured we'd be at the lodge well before it hit. Our route took us along Route 89, a desolate stretch of road that cut through the Rocky Mountains like a scar. The locals had nicknamed it Whispering Pass, a moniker I assumed referred to the way the wind howled through the narrow valleys. The snow began falling harder as we drove deeper into the mountains, the flakes growing larger and thicker, swallowing the world outside in a blur of white. The road became slick with ice, and visibility dropped to mere feet. Mark fiddled with the radio, trying to find a weather update, but all we got was static. The storm was worse than we had anticipated, and an unsettling tension settled over the car. Suddenly, the outline of a vehicle emerged from the snow ahead. It was a black SUV, buried up to its windows in snow, hazard lights faintly flickering. I slowed the car and pulled over, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. "You sure this is a good idea?" Mark asked, his voice tinged with unease. "We can't just leave them here," I replied, stepping out into the biting cold. The wind howled like a living thing, cutting through my jacket as I trudged toward the stranded vehicle. The snow crunched underfoot, and my breath fogged in the freezing air. As I approached the SUV, an eerie silence fell, the storm's ferocity seeming to pause for a moment. The car was completely encased in snow, but the driver's side door was slightly ajar. Peering inside, I saw no one. The seats were empty, the interior pristine, as if whoever had been inside had vanished into thin air. The engine was cold, and the dashboard clock had frozen at 10:17 p.m. A child's mitten lay on the passenger seat, and a faint scent of pine lingered in the air. Mark joined me, his face pale. "Where are they?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "I don't know," I said, stepping back from the SUV. "But we need to call for help." We returned to our car and tried dialing 911, but there was no signal. Frustration turned to fear as the storm intensified, the snow piling higher and the wind screaming through the trees. We decided to continue driving, hoping to find a ranger station or a cabin where we could report the abandoned vehicle. As we drove on, something began to feel off. The snow seemed to fall heavier, the landscape around us growing increasingly surreal. Shapes moved in the periphery of my vision, flickers of shadow against the white void, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Mark grew silent, his unease matching my own as we navigated the treacherous road. About an hour later, we came across another vehicle buried in the snow. This time, it was a rusted pickup truck, its windshield cracked and covered in frost. Like the SUV, it was completely empty, its engine cold and its interior undisturbed. The tracks leading to and from the truck were faint, quickly swallowed by the relentless snow. My chest tightened as a chilling realization dawned on me. We were not the first to encounter this storm's strange grip. "Something's not right," Mark muttered, his eyes scanning the storm-racked wilderness. "It's like the storm is alive." I didn't respond, but his words echoed my own thoughts. There was a sentience to the storm, a malevolence that seemed to toy with us. The wind carried whispers, faint voices that spoke in languages I couldn't understand. The snow pressed against the car like an unseen force, trying to pull us into its depths. As we rounded a bend, the headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt mere feet from the figure. It was a woman, her hair and clothes caked with frost, her skin pale as the snow around her. She stood motionless, her eyes fixed on us with an intensity that froze my blood. Mark rolled down the window slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" he called out. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she raised one hand and pointed toward the forest. Then, without a word, she turned and walked into the snow-covered trees, disappearing into the blizzard. "We can't just leave her out there," Mark said, opening the door. "Wait," I grabbed his arm. "What if this is some kind of trap?" "She's out there alone," Mark argued. "We have to do something." Reluctantly, I agreed, and we stepped out into the storm, following the faint tracks left by the woman. The forest was unnaturally silent, the snow muffling our footsteps as we ventured deeper. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches heavy with ice. The whispers grew louder, circling us like invisible predators. Then we found it, an old station wagon, its headlights barely visible beneath a thick layer of snow. The woman was standing beside it, her back to us. As we approached, she turned slowly, her eyes hollow and her lips forming silent words. My flashlight flickered, and the air grew colder, the whispers now a deafening roar. "Leave," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "You don't belong here." Before we could respond, the ground beneath us shifted, and the snow seemed to rise, swirling around us like a living thing. Shapes emerged from the storm, figures cloaked in shadow, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They moved with the wind, their forms flickering like dying flames. Mark grabbed my arm. "Run!" We turned and bolted back toward the car, the snow dragging at our feet as the figures pursued us. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices that seemed to scream inside my head. My lungs burned as we reached the car, slamming the doors shut and flooring the gas pedal. The tires spun on the ice before finally catching, and we sped down the road, the figures fading into the blizzard behind us. My heart pounded as we drove in silence, the storm slowly losing its grip on the landscape. By the time we reached the lodge, the whispers had faded, replaced by the normal sounds of winter. The next morning, we reported what we had seen to the local authorities. They dismissed our story as the product of stress and exhaustion, but I could see the unease in their eyes. When we returned to Route 89 with a search party, the SUV, the pickup truck, and the station wagon were gone. There were no tracks, no signs that anyone had ever been there. To this day, I can't explain what happened on that road. The storm had taken something from us, our sense of safety, our belief in the rational. And every winter, when the snow begins to fall, I think of the whispers, the figures in the storm, and the woman who warned us to leave. I don't know where those people went or what those shadows wanted. But one thing is certain. Whispering Pass holds secrets that are better left undiscovered. Story number 6. Whispers from the Frozen Lake. Winter in Minnesota was unforgiving, transforming the landscape into a vast expanse of white silence. The Bear Lake, once a vibrant hub for fishing and boating, had succumbed to the relentless cold, its surface now a thick sheet of ice that mirrored the bleak sky above. It was here, amidst the desolate beauty of the frozen wilderness, that my friends and I decided to seek refuge from our hectic lives. We were a tight-knit group: Mike, Sarah, Jenny, and me, bound by years of shared memories and the unspoken understanding that we could rely on each other no matter what. It was the beginning of December when we planned our trip. The idea was simple: spend a weekend on Bear Lake, ice skating under the stars, away from the chaos of work and the incessant buzz of city life. We rented a small cabin on the lake's edge, a quaint wooden structure that seemed almost out of place against the stark, icy backdrop. The locals spoke little of the cabin, their conversations circling around the lake's eerie transformation each winter and the legends that whispered through the pines. The first day passed peacefully. We arrived on a Saturday afternoon, the sun a pale disk struggling to penetrate the heavy cloud cover. The cabin was cozy, with a stone fireplace and large windows that framed the frozen lake perfectly. We spent the day unpacking, setting up our gear, and taking leisurely walks along the ice, marveling at the untouched beauty around us. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter that seemed to echo into the night. On our second night, the true nature of Bear Lake began to reveal itself. The storm had rolled in overnight, bringing with it howling winds and relentless snowfall that thickened the already formidable ice. The wind outside rattled the windows, creating a symphony of eerie sounds that made the cabin feel more like a fragile vessel against the tempestuous elements. We decided to go ice skating despite the storm, drawn by the mesmerizing beauty of the snow-covered landscape illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns. As we glided across the ice, the world around us seemed to blur into a dreamscape of white and shadows. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of our skates on the hard ice and the distant howl of the wind. It was during this serene moment that Mike, always the most adventurous of us, froze mid-skate. His eyes were wide with fear as he listened intently, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We paused, straining our ears against the storm's fury. At first, we heard nothing, just the howling wind and the crackling of ice shifting beneath us. But then, faint whispers began to emerge from beneath the ice, soft and insistent, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with us. The whispers were unintelligible, a blend of pleading and sorrow that sent shivers down my spine. Mike's expression was one of sheer terror. "There's someone down there," he said, backing away from the edge. "We need to leave." Before any of us could respond, he turned and fled across the ice, his departure leaving us in stunned silence. The whispers continued, growing louder and more desperate, echoing around us like the voices of lost souls trapped beneath the frozen surface. Unease settled over us, a palpable tension that made the night feel oppressive and unwelcoming. The next morning, the storm had subsided, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow and an eerie calm. As we stepped out of the cabin, the sun struggled to pierce the lingering clouds, casting a muted light over the frozen lake. It was then that we noticed the footprints, large, unidentifiable prints that led in and out of the cabin but seemed to vanish into thin air. There were no signs of anyone else being with us. No tracks leading away from the house except our own. Jenny, ever the skeptic, examined the footprints closely. "These aren't human," she said, her voice tinged with fear. "They're too large, and the stride is unnatural." We decided to investigate further, retracing Mike's path across the ice. The footprints were sporadic, appearing and disappearing without explanation, leading us to the very edge of the lake where the ice was thinnest. The whispers we had heard the night before seemed to linger in the air, a haunting reminder of the unexplained events. Determined to uncover the truth, we spent the day researching the history of Bear Lake and the cabin. We discovered that, in the winter of 1934, a young woman named Clara Anderson had tragically drowned in the lake during a severe snowstorm. Clara was known for her adventurous spirit and love for ice skating. Much like Mike, her disappearance had been a mystery, with no bodies ever recovered. Only rumors of her spirit lingering on the frozen shores, seeking help to find her way home. That night, as darkness enveloped the lake once more, we decided to hold a séance, hoping to communicate with Clara's restless spirit. We gathered in the living room, lighting candles and placing personal items that belonged to Clara. As we had learned from old newspaper clippings, we began to chant softly, our voices blending with the whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. The atmosphere grew thick with anticipation, the temperature dropping as the wind picked up outside. Suddenly, the candles flickered violently, and the whispers intensified, swirling around us like a spectral storm. Clara's apparition materialized before us, her ethereal form shimmering in the candlelight. Her eyes were filled with a sorrowful longing, her presence both haunting and heartbreaking. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing through the room. "I can't find my way home." Tears welled up in my eyes as I stepped forward, feeling an overwhelming sense of empathy and responsibility. "Clara, we're here to help you. Tell us what you need." Her spirit reached out, her fingers brushing against mine with a chill that sent shivers down my spine. "Find the path," she pleaded, her eyes never leaving mine. "Guide me to safety." Determined to assist her, we embarked on a mission to uncover the hidden secrets of Bear Lake. We learned that Clara had been searching for her lost family member, who had vanished years before under similar mysterious circumstances. Her relentless search had led her to the very spot where we had encountered the whispers and the inexplicable footprints. Armed with this knowledge, we returned to the cabin the following night, prepared to help Clara find her way. We set up markers along the frozen lake, creating a pathway that we hoped would guide her spirit back to safety. As we laid out the markers, the whispers grew softer, the oppressive tension easing as if Clara was beginning to find her way. Under the light of a full moon, we completed the pathway, stepping back to observe. The air was still, the only sound the gentle crackling of the fireplace. Suddenly, Clara's spirit appeared once more, her form more defined and her expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice now a soothing balm that resonated through the cabin. "I can finally rest." A warm light enveloped the room, the oppressive cold lifting as the storm outside subsided. The whispers ceased, replaced by a serene silence that settled over us like a comforting blanket. Clara's apparition faded into the night, her spirit finally finding peace. In the days that followed, the mysterious footprints ceased, and the sense of being watched dissipated, leaving behind only the memory of Clara's tragic story and the bond we had formed in helping her find peace. Bear Lake returned to its tranquil state, the legends now a testament to the enduring power of friendship and compassion. But even now, years later, the memory of those winter nights in Minnesota remains vivid in my mind. On quiet evenings, when the wind whispers through the pines and the snow blankets the world in silence, I sometimes catch a glimpse of a ghostly figure standing by the window, her eyes filled with gratitude and peace. It serves as a haunting reminder that some souls never truly leave, their stories forever etched into the frozen landscapes they once called home. Story number 7. The Frozen Whisper. I've always been drawn to the enigmatic, the places where history and mystery intertwine, leaving behind whispers that linger in the cold air. So, when I inherited an old wooden house nestled deep within the forests of Vermont, I saw it as the perfect opportunity to escape the relentless pace of city life and immerse myself in the serene isolation of the countryside. Little did I know, the house harbored secrets that would turn my peaceful retreat into a living nightmare. The house stood alone on the edge of a frozen river, its timber frame weathered by countless winters and the harshest of storms. Built in the late 1800s, it had served as the home of the Whitaker family for generations. But in the winter of 1934, tragedy struck. Eleanor Whitaker, a young woman with a spirit as vibrant as the autumn leaves, went missing during a brutal snowstorm. She was found the next morning, lifeless and frozen in front of the house, her eyes staring blankly into the void. The local townsfolk were devastated, their grief compounded by the mysterious circumstances surrounding her death. Years passed, and the house remained abandoned, shrouded in layers of snow and silence. Locals spoke of eerie occurrences, strange lights flickering in the windows on cold winter nights, and the unmistakable sound of a woman's soft sobs carried by the wind. But it wasn't until I decided to make the house my winter sanctuary that the legends became my reality. I arrived in late November, the first heavy snowflakes of the season beginning to fall as I drove the narrow, winding road that led to the house. Pine trees heavy with snow stood like silent sentinels, their branches creaking under the weight of winter's grip. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and foreboding, the wooden siding cracked and worn by years of neglect. Despite its eerie appearance, there was an undeniable charm to its rustic beauty, a timeless quality that beckoned me inside. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, exploring the creaky halls, and settling into the rhythm of cabin life. The isolation was a welcome change, the silence only broken by the occasional crackle of the fireplace and the howling of the wind outside. But as the nights grew longer and the snow deeper, an unsettling feeling began to settle over me. It started subtly, faint noises that could be mistaken for the settling of an old house, the sound of footsteps echoing through the empty rooms, the soft murmur of a woman's voice carried by the wind. I dismissed them as figments of my imagination, the result of my solitary confinement in the desolate wilderness. Yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. One particularly bitter night, as a fierce snowstorm raged outside, I sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket and sipping hot tea. The wind howled like a chorus of lost souls, and the snow piled high against the windows, obscuring the world outside. It was then that I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping emanating from the walls. It was steady, almost deliberate, like the measured steps of someone walking through the house. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously followed the sound. The tapping led me to the hallway, where shadows danced menacingly on the walls, cast by the flickering light of the fireplace. I pressed my ear against the cold, wooden wall, trying to discern the source of the noise. It seemed to come from behind a heavy tapestry that hung at the end of the corridor. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the tapestry aside, revealing a hidden doorway I hadn't noticed before. The room beyond was small and cramped, filled with old, dusty furniture covered in white sheets. The tapping had ceased, leaving behind an oppressive silence that pressed down on me. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and scanned the room with my flashlight. That's when I saw her, a ghostly figure standing by the window, her back to me. She was clad in a flowing white dress, her hair cascading down her shoulders like a frozen waterfall. Her presence was both ethereal and sorrowful, her form shimmering in the dim light. I watched, transfixed, as she turned to face me, her eyes hollow pools of despair that seemed to pierce through my very soul. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a haunting melody that echoed through the room. "I can't find my way home." I stumbled back, fear gripping me as the temperature in the room plummeted. The woman's form began to fade, dissolving into the shadows like mist in the morning sun. I stood there, heart pounding, unable to comprehend what I had just witnessed. The oppressive silence returned, leaving me alone with the lingering sense of sorrow that hung in the air. The next morning, I sought answers, determined to understand the ghostly apparition that had visited me. I visited the local library in Pine Ridge, where I pored over old newspaper clippings and town records. I learned about Eleanor Whitaker's tragic fate, the circumstances of her disappearance, and the legends that had grown around the house. It became clear that her spirit was trapped, unable to find peace after her untimely death. Determined to help her find closure, I decided to perform a ritual of remembrance. I gathered candles, personal items I had found during my exploration of the house, and set them up in the living room. As night fell and the snow continued to blanket the landscape, I began to chant the words of an ancient Algonquian prayer, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. The air grew thick with anticipation, the temperature dropping even further as the spirits began to manifest. The room was filled with a soft, golden light, and the ghostly figure of Eleanor appeared before me once more, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice now carrying a sense of peace. "Now I can finally rest." As her spirit began to fade, the oppressive energy lifted, replaced by a serene calm that settled over the cabin like a comforting blanket. The snowstorm outside subsided, the winds dying down to a gentle whisper as if nature itself had heeded her plea. In the days that followed, the haunting ceased, and the house returned to its tranquil state. The sense of being watched and the eerie noises were gone, leaving behind only the memory of Eleanor's sorrow and the peace she had finally found. I left Maplewood House with a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that I had played a part in helping a restless spirit find her way home. But even now, years later, the memory of those winter nights in Vermont remains vivid in my mind. On the coldest evenings, when the wind whispers through the pines and the snow blankets the world in silence, I sometimes catch a glimpse of a ghostly figure standing by a window, her eyes filled with gratitude and peace. It serves as a haunting reminder that some stories are etched into the very fabric of our existence, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover the truth and bring light to the shadows.